Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor. Well, unfortunately, William Engdahl, we've not been able to get a hold of him. He is in Germany. He lives there, and he was scheduled to be with us. There must be some time difference, some issue that has come up, and he is not available. We were looking forward to talking to him about his views on what the real purpose of Donald Trump, or what the agenda of Donald Trump really was, and some very interesting ideas about that. But we're very fortunate to have Jeff Deist join us, and Jeff will probably have some ideas about that as well. Thanks for joining me on this short notice, Jeff.
Yeah, Jay, it's great to be with you, and I would love to hear someone across the pond talking about Trump, because we've heard maybe as much as we can stand from our own people about him.
Oh, my goodness. Regurgitation, day in, day out. It's too much. Well, Engdahl's thesis, Jeff, and just throw this at you, and I would love to hear what Daniel McAdams has to say about this as well, because it is geopolitical. Engdahl, I don't know if you're familiar with, has written a book called The Gods of Money. He's written another one recently called The Lost Hegemon, Whom the Gods Would Destroy. A Century of War is another book. A very prolific writer and historian. And his thesis is that essentially that the deep state, whoever that is, and he has his ideas who the deep state is, are really concerned, really that Trump is not somebody that they're opposed to, in fact, even though it would appear that the mainstream was definitely anti-Trump and then some. But his idea is that what Trump is really doing is sort of a divide and conquer, or that he is meant to be sort of a divide and conquer strategy that would get in the way of the growing global trade that's going on between, let's say, the one bridge, one road, or the Silk Road that is being built up, the infrastructure that's being built up between China, India, Russia, Iran. And, they're setting up their own trading infrastructure, their own banking infrastructure. When we tried to freeze Russia out of the SWIFT system, the BRICS set up their own trading system, their own banking system, and so on and so forth. Does that sound like a really crazy idea, that, whether or not it's intended that could be, because Trump has seemed to make some overtures, or at least open the door to the possibility of a less frigid relationship with Russia, with Putin. At the same time, he's just been nasty as nails with respect to China.
I don't think it's crazy. First and foremost, it depends on one's personal view of what the deep state is and whether it exists. I certainly believe it exists, and I certainly think to a large extent, not entirely, but to a large extent, it steers the ship. So from that perspective, elites don't necessarily fear Trump in the way progressives do or mainstream media types do, because they feel like Trump will cause waves at the surface, but below the surface they'll continue to drive things that benefit them in the long term. That said, I think there is some legitimate angst about him. I don't think he's some sort of plant. I don't think he was put up to this. I don't think he was anticipated. And the fact that he's come along and thrown a populist wrench into what seemed like this inevitability narrative of our globalist friends this is very, very important and not planned. And I think the fact that he's not bellicose with Russia is of huge concern to U.S. neoconservatives, Western neoconservatives, and let's face it, the current economic world order is not particularly in the BRIC countries' long-term interests. They have their own interests.
Yeah.
They have their own energy, their own markets. So it's, I'm not one of these people who says, well, this is meaningless and behind the scenes they're all pulling the strings. I really do think that this was a disruption of sorts.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's certainly something, as you point out, the Brexit, and now in France, it seems like no matter who wins the big election in France, you're going to have more of a populist government there. What is your understanding of the picture in France? I know that you've met up with Marie Le Pen in the past when you were working with Congressman Paul.
Yeah, it appears now increasingly likely that she's not going to prevail as in the election, but the fact of the matter is that not only her party, but also events in Europe, particularly in Germany, with Syrian immigrants, has pulled all European governments and hence all European politicians more towards a right populist position. And it's not xenophobic. A term that is thrown around much too loosely. It's not xenophobic to love one's country in its ways. That's not nationalism. Nationalism is wanting to impose the ways of one's country on others. So I get a little tired of this Western media penchant for labeling anything that involves any kind of immigration restrictions as far right. Because if you look at Le Pen's platform, if you look at the platform of AfD in Germany, if you look at the platform of some of the parties in far right so-called parties in the Netherlands, they're actually very, they want to increase pensions, they want to increase welfare spending. So the only thing that's right about them is they're not crazy about immigration. So I think we have to understand that what's happening in Europe shouldn't be understood through the filter of the media we get. It should be understood from a common sense perspective, which is people in France and beautiful Paris don't like having huge, dangerous neighborhoods full of Muslim immigrants that are crime-ridden and they can't go to. This is common sense. This isn't xenophobia, Jay.
No. No, so certainly seen pictures of Paris. Even Paris is cluttered and littered with ugliness. It's easy to understand. Well, on the economic front, Trumponomics, which David Stockman wrote about yesterday and again today, he's not too hopeful, and I think you would certainly agree with David's contention that it's not very promising so far. The people that Trump seems to be pulling close to him in terms of the economics. I guess we haven't had a Treasury Secretary yet, unless it's announced in the last few hours or so. What is your sense of where Trumponomics might go? Because David is saying, well, what we really need to do is really an Austrian prescription, is go back to price discovery for capital, for goodness sakes, and cleanse. I think you said lance the boil. Let's go back. He said at least during when he was with his boss, Ronald Reagan, at least Reagan wasn't a genius when it came to economics, but he did understand that you couldn't have endless amounts of money creation and debt creation without the system breaking down at some point. And Stockman is suggesting he doesn't see any indication at this point in time that Trump has any such understanding.
No, I'm sure he doesn't. But what's important to understand here is that he is a populist. He ran as a populist, not as a libertarian, not as a supply side mainstream conservative. And I'm frankly encouraged. I mean, I like the fact that he's at least spoken with John Allison, who used to be the head of Cato, and was a bank president for many years, and has written some papers and a book talking about getting rid of the Fed, that as long as we have a Fed, there will always be bubbles and dislocations. I'm glad he's spoken, apparently, to the congresswoman from Hawaii, who was very anti-neocon and very much in favor of a balanced worldview. I'm glad he's spoken to Thomas Massey, the congressman from Kentucky, who's a friend of Ron Paul and Rand Paul, and who's a guy with a tech background who has a bunch of patents to his name. If Gary Johnson was doing these things, libertarians would be trumpeting them. If we end up with Petraeus and Rudy Giuliani and Mitt Romney and Bolton and people like this in the cabinet, obviously we know what that means. But the fact that he's talking to people outside the normal Washington sphere is a good thing. So but his actions are going to tell the story. So we won't really know until January.
Well, who are some names besides? All those are horrible possibilities for Secretary of State. Is there anybody that might fit in with Trump? If you just take what Trump said during the elections, or during the campaign, when he was talking about his foreign policy, which would have been less intrusive, perhaps, although at the same time he's talking about making America's military great again and all that sort of stuff. Is there anybody out there? There's just almost nobody out there that would fit our desire as libertarians, Jeff. Can you think of anybody? Trump, by his nature, isn't a libertarian. Ron Paul's a libertarian. He lives it. He breathes it. He is a freedom-loving human being who respects the rights of everybody else. And the last thing I think that your ex-boss, Ron Paul, would ever want to be is a dictator, a strong-arm guy, and Trump seems to be that kind of a personality. It just seems difficult. Could there be anybody on the horizon for Secretary of State that might work with Trump?
Well, I think there's a couple of choices. First of all, it's not Secretary of Defense. This doesn't have to be someone who's beloved, a rah-rah troop supporter. Hillary certainly wasn't beloved by the troops. John Kerry isn't. So I think a Rand Paul or a Dana Rohrabacher from California, someone who has talked about being less bellicose with regard to this engagement in Syria, someone who's talked about being less bellicose in the war on terror, would be great. And frankly, both Rand Paul and Dana Rohrabacher have said things in the past that mostly comport with Trump, that Rand Paul has suggested that we shouldn't be allowing Islamic immigrants from certain terror watch list countries in to the country. So he hasn't always sounded like a dovish libertarian either. So, I think there are names, but when it comes to foreign policy, there is such an entrenched DC worldview, and that is controlled by neoconservatives, that it would be almost earth-shaking if he chose someone outside of the neoconservative framework like a Rand Paul or a Dana. That would get him a lot of heat very quickly.
Yeah, well, let's say he chooses somebody that is, one of those names that we're hearing every day. Let's say a Romney or a Petraeus or somebody like that. I mean, geez, I perish the thought. But the point is, could he control them, or would he not? He wouldn't have the knowledge that's needed, probably, and the connections that's needed to really keep them under wraps. Let's say that Trump had a well-defined foreign policy in his own mind. Could he do anything about it, or would this military-industrial complex be so powerful that they would make darn sure that he went along with it?
It's hard to say. I don't think we can ever expect a non-interventionist worldview from Trump, but we could expect an America First worldview from Trump that might result in less engagement for our troops around the world. And that might be the best we could hope for. And I would love to see that. I would love to see some kind of unwinding of what's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we still have thousands of troops. Some kind of de-escalation of our threats in Syria. These may sound like small victories, but I would absolutely take them, given what we know Hillary would have done, which would be to ratchet up everything to prove herself as a leader, and to she was absolutely owned by neoconservatives. So there's a glimmer of hope.
All right, Jeff. Well, we'll have to leave it go at that. A glimmer of hope is a good place to stop. We're out of time. I want to thank you so much for coming on such short notice. And tell the folks that they should go to Mises.org. Mises.org. Jeff writes, and he heads up that organization now. And you've got a lot of good things there, Jeff. And I would love for our people to pay more attention to what you're doing there at Mises.org. Lots of good scholars and lots of great ideas. Libertarians. It's a libertarian free market website. And if you understand the virtues of free markets, you don't want to miss Mises.org. Thank you so much, Jeff, for being with us. And